Welcome to Stamps Old World UK, where history, value, and the timeless beauty of philately come alive. In today's video, we are going to focus on one of the most iconic American stamps ever produced, the red 2-cent George Washington stamp. This stamp is not only a tribute to the first president of the United States, George Washington, but also a piece of history that represents an era when postage was more than just a necessity. It was a reflection of national pride and artistry. The 2-cent Washington stamp has become one of the most collected stamps in American philately, and today we will explore its history, design, variations, and most importantly, its market value in today's world measured in United States dollars. The red 2-cent George Washington stamp was first issued in the early years of the 20th century. It quickly became one of the most widely circulated stamps of its time because the 2-cent rate was the standard postage for mailing a simple letter within the United States. Millions of these stamps were printed and used on everyday correspondence, which is why so many examples survive to this day. Yet, despite the massive production numbers, this stamp remains highly collectible because of the historical importance of George Washington, the numerous design variations that exist, and the nostalgia it carries for collectors. The design itself is striking. It features a detailed portrait of George Washington framed by an ornate border that highlights the years 1732 to 1932, marking the bicentennial of Washington's birth. The bold red ink makes it instantly recognizable. While this stamp may seem common at first glance, serious collectors know that the details matter. Slight differences in shade, perforation, or printing can dramatically affect the value of the stamp. For instance, certain versions were printed with different perforation sizes, and some had watermarks while others did not. Each of these variations can place a stamp into a different category of rarity. When it comes to market value, most of the common 2-cent Washington stamps are not extremely rare. If you own a used example with cancellation marks, the value may only be a few cents to perhaps a couple of dollars. These were mass-produced and used daily by millions of Americans, so they are not particularly scarce in their simplest form. However, the story changes completely when we consider stamps that are in mint condition. A perfectly preserved 2-cent Washington with no damage, sharp corners, and original gum on the back can fetch anywhere from $10 to $50 in today's collector market. If the stamp is well centered, with a bright, clean appearance, the value can be significantly higher. But here is where things become fascinating. Within the world of 2-cent Washington stamps, there are rarer varieties that are highly sought after by philatelists. For example, there are printing errors where the alignment was off, color variations where the red ink appeared too light or too dark, and even rare cases of misprints that make a stamp extremely desirable. Some unusual varieties of the 2-cent Washington have sold for hundreds of dollars at auctions, especially if they are in superb mint condition. Exceptional examples with certificates of authenticity, sharp perforations, and no faults can even reach values of $1,000 or more in today's market. One of the reasons this stamp continues to captivate collectors is the historical significance of George Washington himself. Washington is not only a symbol of American independence and leadership, but also one of the most depicted figures on U.S. stamps. Having him on a widely circulated postage stamp in the early 20th century gave ordinary citizens a chance to hold a piece of history in their hands every time they mailed a letter. For collectors today, owning a 2-cent Washington is like holding a fragment of that era, a direct link to the past when handwritten letters were the lifeline of communication. In today's collecting world, the market value of stamps is influenced not only by rarity and condition, but also by the growing interest in alternative investments. Just as rare coins, vintage wine, or fine art appreciate over time, stamps have found their place as collectibles that can hold or increase their value. Auction houses in New York, London, and online platforms frequently list 2-cent Washington stamps, and while common ones sell quickly at modest prices, the rarities spark bidding wars that drive the price up in U.S. dollars. This makes the 2-cent Washington stamp not only a nostalgic collectible, but also a potential investment for the dedicated philatelist. It is important to note that anyone who owns a 2-cent Washington stamp should carefully examine its condition. Even the slightest tear, crease, or faded color can reduce its value. On the other hand, A well-preserved example, stored properly in a protective album, can maintain or even increase in value over time. Collectors should also be aware of authentication services that can confirm whether a stamp is a common version or a rare variety, as the difference in market value can be dramatic. For beginners who are curious about the value of their own 2-cent Washington stamp, catalogs such as the Scott Catalog or Stanley Gibbons provide detailed references on varieties and pricing. Comparing your stamp to these guides can give you a clear idea of where it stands in the market today. Online collector communities and professional appraisers can also provide advice. Remember, philately is as much about passion and knowledge as it is about money. As we close today's video, it is worth remembering that the red 2-cent Washington stamp represents more than just a piece of old postage. It represents the spirit of communication in an earlier time, the pride of a nation in honoring its founding father, and the artistry of stamp design in the early 20th century. Whether your stamp is worth a few cents or several $100s, it carries history in its paper and ink, and for that reason alone, it deserves a place in any stamp collection.
Next up, the red 2-cent George Washington from the Washington Franklin series. At first glance, this stamp might seem like a common piece of red paper with the portrait of America's first president, but in truth, it is part of one of the most complex and intriguing chapters in United States philatelic history. More importantly for collectors today, its value can range from just a few cents all the way into the hundreds or even thousands of dollars, depending on variety and condition. The Washington Franklin series was first issued in 1908 and remained in production until 1922. It was named after the two American icons who dominated the designs, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. The 2-cent red Washington was by far the most widely used of the entire series because the 2-cent rate was the standard postage for sending a letter within the United States at that time. As a result, millions upon millions of these stamps were printed and circulated, making it one of the most common stamps in U.S. history. However, the story does not end there. The Washington Franklin issues were printed using different perforations, different watermarks, and even different printing techniques. These variations create an enormous range of collectible types, and the values can vary wildly in today's market. The design itself is elegant and simple. It features a left-facing profile of George Washington, framed by laurel leaves with the words U.S. postage above and the denomination 2 cents below. While at first it may look identical to many other Washington stamps, serious collectors know that details such as the perforation size, the watermark on the paper, and the printing method distinguish one issue from another. Some of these distinctions can only be identified using a perforation gauge or a watermark detector, which means that two stamps that appear identical to the naked eye might in fact differ in market value by hundreds of dollars. Now, let us talk about value in today's U.S. dollars. Because so many of these stamps were produced and used, the vast majority that survive today are worth very little. A standard used 2-cent Washington from the series typically sells for 10 cents to $1. Even though it is over a century old, it is not rare in its most common forms. Mint condition examples, however, carry more interest. A typical mint stamp that has been hinged in an album may be worth between $2 and $15. A mint never hinged example with perfect gum and good centering can rise into the $20 to $50 range depending on the exact issue. But here is where things get exciting. Certain rare varieties of the 2-cent Washington are highly sought after by philatelists. For instance, stamps with unusual perforation combinations or those printed on paper with scarce watermarks can be worth $50 to $100 or more. There are also color variations, such as bright red or carmine shades that command premiums. The rarest types, particularly those from the early printings with scarce perforations or unusual production methods, can fetch several $100s. In fact, at major auctions, perfectly centered examples of these rarities in mint never-hinged condition have sold for over $1,000. For collectors, the difference between a stamp worth $1 and one worth $1,000 can be as subtle as the size of the perforation or the presence of a double-line watermark. One example worth noting is the 2-cent Washington with the double-line USPS watermark and perforation 12. This stamp, while outwardly common, becomes far more valuable when found in mint never-hinged condition, with values ranging from $100 to $300. Another scarce example is the so-called rotary press printings, which are slightly larger in design than the flat plate issues. These can be difficult to identify without measurement, but once confirmed, they can be worth several $100s to the right collector. The lesson here for collectors is that knowledge is power. Owning a red 2-cent Washington is easy since so many exist, but identifying which version you have can be the difference between owning a common stamp worth less than $1 and a philatelic treasure worth hundreds. Catalogs such as Scott or Stanley Gibbons provide detailed listings of each variation, and investing in basic tools like a watermark detector and perforation gauge can unlock hidden value in your collection. It is also important to remember the role of condition in determining value. A stamp that is damaged, creased, heavily canceled, or poorly centered will always be worth less, even if it's technically a rare variety. On the other hand, a stamp that is crisp, clean, well-centered, and mint never hinged will always command premium prices in today's market. For serious investors and collectors, condition is everything. In conclusion, the 2-cent George Washington stamp from the Washington Franklin series may be one of the most common stamps in American history, but it is also one of the most rewarding to study and collect. Its many varieties, subtle differences, and potential hidden treasures make it a fascinating area for philatelists. In today's market, values can range from just a few cents for common used examples to well over $1,000 for rare varieties in top condition. That's what makes this stamp so exciting. It proves that even the most ordinary-looking stamp can hold extraordinary value if you know what to look for.